Can I leave this table as partitioned without using a partitioning license? And the answer is yes. To take a table that has billions of rows that's been carefully partitioned and then think, oh, I didn't really want to partition this, make it not partitioned so I don't hit any license issues, is perhaps simply taking you back to the same problem. I've got this massive table that is difficult to manage. The question is, can I exploit partitioning without having a partitioning license? And yes, you can. So I'm going to create a table here which is partitioned. It would require the partitioning license because I'm using the standard partitioning facilities there. An automatic partition table, one partition per owner, but I've only restricted it to a 4-partition table. The owners are Sys, System, Scott, and HR, just to keep the volume small. If I look at this, I've got 4 partitions, and the high value, it shows you the actual list, the owner that corresponds to each partition. Assuming this table is massive, the reason I partitioned it in the first place is because it was huge. Can I leave this table as partitioned without using a partitioning license? And the answer is yes. I'm going to do it with the following PL/SQL block, and let's just fly through it briefly. I've got a little routine here called DDL, which simply runs some DDL, but also spits out the command we ran so we can see it as it runs. I'm going to loop through each of the partitions in this table, starting with the first partition, and we saw there was only 4 partitions, 1 for each owner. I'm going to create a table for exchange and then do an exchange partition with each partition. Now, there's a bit more stuff in terms of the code, but if we run it, we'll get a better idea what's actually being run. I looped through each partition, and the first thing I did was I said, let's create a table called partition view sys, and that's going to be exchanged with the partition called P1, which was for the sys owner. Then I create one called pview system, which I'll exchange with this partition, which was the system owner, and so forth for HR and Scott, etc. So now, rather than having 4 partitions, I've got 4 tables, each one's mapping to the original 4 partitions. That's really not much good to me because I've now got 4 different objects I would need to query. However, I can now look at these tables. There's my 4 tables. But way back in Oracle 7, believe it or not, before we introduced partitioning in Oracle 8, we could actually have a thing called partition views, which said if you have identical tables in terms of structure and content, if you create a view over the top of them, then we can treat that table as if it was a partition table for some purposes. So let's build a routine again to do that. Once again, this thing's going to loop through the 4 partitions, and this time it's going to add a check constraint to make sure that the only rows in each of these tables maps to the correct owner. And then we're going to build a view that sits over the whole top of them. So once again, that's just a bit of PL/SQL to loop through it. Let's run it. And this is what we did. On the table called sys, pview sys, we created a constraint called pview sys check, which said the owner has to be sys. For system, the owner has to be system. For HR, the owner has to be HR, etc. Those check constraints are vital when it comes to querying partition views. And the final partition view is this thing called partition view, which is simply a union all with some line wrapping there of the 4 tables. This is how we used to do it back in Oracle 7. So now I have this table called partition view, which is the consolidation of those 4 smaller tables. This is homegrown partitioning. The reason it's useful is if you do put, let me scroll up a bit, those check constraints on, then the database is still smart enough to do what the modern equivalent is called partition elimination. If I say, go get all the rows where the owner equals HR, you can see it looks like it's actually scanned all 4 tables. But in front of each one, there's a filter. In line 3, the filter is null is not null. That's always false. So we will not scan the sys table. We will not scan the system table. We will scan the HR table because that was in this criteria here, but we will not scan the Scott table. So we're getting partition elimination even in this old style version of partition views. There's more work to be done here. If I wanted to have DML on that partition view, I would need to create instead of triggers, etc., to make sure it goes into the right table, etc. But if you are desperate to break up a large object into a smaller number of discrete objects, so for manageability, but you can't get the partitioning license, then this is a way you could do it. You can go back to this old style version of partition views we had 2 decades ago in Oracle 7.